apology, she continued. All of us. We've been treating you like you were still that little girl trying to keep up with the older cousins. We didn't see the accomplished woman you've become. The question is, I said, would you have treated me differently if you'd known about the money? Because if respect is contingent on financial success, then it's not really respect at all. Aunt Helen was quiet for a moment. You're right, she said finally. We should have valued you for who you are, not what you have. We should have celebrated your achievements instead of dismissing them. We should have defended you instead of making excuses for markers. It was the closest thing to a real apology I'd ever received from my family, and it meant more than I'd expected it to. What happens now? She asked. Now, I said, we see if you can treat me with respect going forward, not because of my bank account, but because I'm a person who deserves basic human dignity. We can do that, Aunt Helen said. We want to do that. 6 months later, I was hosting my first family gathering at my renovated Victorian house. The dining room table seated 12 comfortably, and I prepared a meal that showcased both my cooking skills and my ability to create a warm, welcoming environment. The conversation was different this time. Instead of dismissing my work, family members asked genuine questions about my business and my clients. Instead of offering unsolicited advice about my personal life, they listened when I talked about my goals and aspirations. Instead of treating me like a child, they engaged with me as an equal. Marcus was there, humbler than I'd ever seen him. His business had indeed failed, and he was working for someone else now, a position that had taught invaluable lessons about humility and respect. He thanked me privately for not sharing the details of his financial troubles with the rest of the family, a gesture of discretion he hadn't expected, but deeply appreciated. I've been thinking about what you said, he told me as we cleared dishes after dinner. About contribution and sacrifice, I realise now that I was measuring everything by the wrong standards. What do you mean? I asked. I thought contribution meant writing checks, he said, but you've been contributing your time, your expertise, your emotional support for years. You've been the one listening to everyone's problems, celebrating our successes, offering help when we needed it. I was so focused on money that I couldn't see the other ways you were showing up for this family. It was a profound admission from someone who had spent decades defining worth by financial metrics. Thank you for saying that, I said. I should have said it years ago, he replied. As the evening wound down and family members began to leave, I stood on my front porch watching them walk to their cars. These were still the same people who had hurt me so deeply that night at Romano's, but they were also people capable of growth, of learning, of becoming better versions of themselves. $2,347 I'd spent on that dinner had been the best investment I'd ever made, not because it had bought their respect. Respect can't be purchased, but because it had forced all of us to confront the truth about our relationships and our values. I'd learned that I didn't need their approval to be successful or happy. They'd learned that success comes in many forms, and that treating people with dignity shouldn't depend on their bank account balance. Most importantly, we'd all learned that family isn't just about shared DNA. It's about choosing to see each other clearly, to support each other genuinely, and to love each other without conditions. The selfish cousin who had never contributed to the family had finally taught them the most valuable lesson of all, that true contribution comes from the heart, not the wallet. The end, sometimes the most expensive lesson, is the one that teaches us our own worth. Sarah's story reminds us that respect earned through fear or money is hollow, but respect built on genuine understanding and mutual dignity can transform even the most broken relationships. She was right. My family knew I ran a consulting business, but they had no idea about the scope of my success. They didn't know that my company had grown from a one-person operation to a team of 12 employees. They didn't know that we'd been featured in 3 major business publications this year. They didn't know that I'd been invited to speak at industry conferences, or that my client retention rate was 97%. Most importantly, they didn't know about the numbers. My business had generated over $2 million in revenue last year, and my personal income was higher than most of theirs combined. The little startup they dismissed so casually was more successful than Uncle Frank's failed restaurant, more profitable than Marcus's real estate ventures, and more stable than most of their traditional careers. They think I'm barely scraping by, I admitted to Rachel. They see me as the struggling single woman who needs their pity and advice. Maybe it's time they learn the truth, Rachel suggested. Not to show off, but to set the record straight about who you really are and what you've accomplished. After hanging up with Rachel, I spent the morning working on a proposal for a new client, a manufacturing company that wanted to expand into international markets. It was exactly the kind of complex, high-stakes project that energized me, requiring strategic thinking, market analysis, and creative problem-solving. As I worked, I felt the familiar satisfaction of using my skills to solve real problems for real businesses. My phone rang around noon. It was Aunt Helen, and this time I decided to answer. "Sarah, sweetheart," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she was trying to smooth over family conflicts. "I've been thinking about last night, and I wanted to apologise for Marcus's behaviour. He was completely out of line." "Thank you for saying that," I replied, though I noticed she was apologising for Marcus rather than asking him to apologise for himself. "He's been under a lot of stress lately," she continued. "The real estate market has been challenging and he's worried about making his mortgage payments. I think he just lashed out because he's feeling insecure about his own situation." There it was. The excuse, the justification, the attempt to make Marcus's cruelty understandable and therefore forgivable. It was the same pattern I'd seen countless times over the years. Marcus would be cruel, the family would make excuses for him, and I would be expected to accept the apology and move on as if nothing had happened. "Aunt Helen," I said carefully, "Marcus didn't just lash out. He deliberately attacked my character in front of the entire family. He accused me of being selfish and never contributing to the family. That wasn't stress talking. That was his genuine opinion of me." "Oh, sweetheart, you know that's not true," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Marcus loves you. We all love you. Your family. If that's what love looks like in this family," I said, "then I think I'll pass." There was a long silence before Aunt Helen spoke again. "What do you want from us, Sarah? What would it take to fix this?" It was a fair question, and I took a moment to consider my answer. What would it take? An acknowledgement that they'd treated me poorly, a genuine apology from Marcus, a commitment to treat me with respect going forward. "I want you to see me," I said finally. "I want you to see who I actually am instead of who you think I should be. I want you to value my achievements instead of dismissing them. I want you to treat me like a successful adult instead of a struggling child who needs your guidance." "But we do see you," Aunt Helen protested. We're proud of what you've accomplished. Are you? I asked. Because last night, Marcus made it clear that he thinks I've never contributed anything to this family, and none of you contradicted him. We were shocked, she said weakly. We didn't know what to say. You could have said it wasn't true, I replied. You could have defended me. You could have told Marcus that his behaviour was unacceptable. But you didn't. You all just sat there and let him attack me. The conversation ended without resolution, as I'd known it would. Aunt Helen wanted me to forgive and forget, to return to the family dynamic where Marcus's behaviour was excused and my feelings were minimised. But I was done with that dynamic. Over the next few days, I received calls and messages from various family members, all following the same pattern. They acknowledged that Marcus had been a bit harsh, but they wanted me to understand his perspective, to make allowances for his stress, to be the bigger person and reach out to him first. None of them seemed to understand that the problem wasn't just Marcus's outburst. It was the years of accumulated slights, dismissals and condescension that had led to that moment. It was the family's willingness to excuse his behaviour while expecting me to absorb his cruelty without complaint. A week after the dinner, I was working late in my home office when my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see Marcus standing on my porch, looking uncomfortable and uncertain. I considered not answering, but curiosity got the better of me. What do you want, Marcus? I asked through the door. I want to apologise, he said. Can we talk? I opened the door but didn't invite him in. He looked terrible, unshaven, exhausted, wearing clothes that looked like he'd slept in them. I'm sorry, he said immediately. I was completely out of line the other night. I said things I didn't mean, and I hurt you. I'm sorry. Which things didn't you mean? I asked. The part where you said I've never contributed to the family. The part where you called me selfish. The part where you accused me of taking without giving back. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. I was angry about other things, and I took it out on you. It wasn't fair. What other things? I pressed. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. My business is failing, he admitted. I'm 3 months behind on my mortgage, and the bank is threatening foreclosure. My wife is talking about leaving me. My son might have to transfer to a state school because I can't afford Princeton anymore. I felt a flicker of sympathy for him, but it was quickly overwhelmed by anger. So, because your life is falling apart, you decided to attack mine. I was jealous, he said, the words coming out in a rush. You seemed so content, so confident. You've built this business from nothing. You bought this beautiful house. You're successful and independent, and I'm losing everything. The admission hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I wanted to cross. For the first time in our lives, Marcus was being genuinely vulnerable with me, acknowledging that his attack had come from his own insecurities rather than any real failing on my part. Marcus, I said carefully, I'm sorry you're struggling, but that doesn't excuse what you said to me, and it doesn't change the fact that our family has been treating me like a second-class citizen for years. I know, he said, and I want to make it right. What can I do? I looked at this man who had tormented me throughout our childhood, who had dismissed my achievements and questioned my worth for decades, who was now standing on my porch asking for forgiveness. Part of me wanted to slam the door in his face, to let him experience the rejection and dismissal he'd shown me for so many years. But another part of me, the part that had been shaped by my grandmother's teachings about grace and forgiveness, wanted to find a way forward. You can start by telling the family the truth, I said. You can acknowledge that what you said was wrong, that success is real and valuable, even if it doesn't fit your narrow definition of achievement. I will, Marcus said immediately. I'll call everyone. I'll set the record straight. And you can stop making excuses for treating people badly, I continued. Stress doesn't justify cruelty, Marcus. Financial problems don't give you the right to attack other people's character. You're right, he said. I know you're right. I studied his face, trying to determine if his remorse was genuine or just another manipulation. There's something else you should know, I said finally. My little startup generated over $2 million in revenue last year. I personally made more money than you, Uncle Frank, and probably half the family combined. So when you talk about contribution and sacrifice, remember that I've been supporting local charities, creating jobs, and building something meaningful, while you've been struggling to keep your inherited advantages. Marcus's face went white as he processed this information. $2 million revenue, I clarified. But yes, the business you've all been dismissing as a cute hobby is actually more successful than most of your traditional careers. He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him recalculating everything he thought he knew about my life and my choices. Why didn't you ever tell us? He asked. Because it shouldn't matter, I said. My worth as a person and as a family member shouldn't depend on my bank account. But since that seems to be the only language you understand, there it is. Marcus left that night with a promise to make things right with the family, to acknowledge his mistakes and set the record straight about my contributions and achievements. I wasn't entirely convinced he would follow through, but I'd said what I needed to say. 3 days later, I received a call from Aunt Helen. Her voice was different, respectful in a way it had never been before. Sarah, she said, Marcus told us about your business, about how successful you've been. We had no idea. I know, I said simply. The cool evening air hit my face as I stepped out of Romano's, and for the first time in hours, I could breathe freely. My hands were shaking slightly, not from fear or regret, but from the adrenaline of finally standing up for myself after years of accepting their casual cruelty. I walked to my car with measured steps, refusing to look back at the restaurant where my family was undoubtedly processing what had just happened. As I drove through the quiet streets toward my new house, my phone began buzzing with calls and text messages. I ignored them all, focusing instead on the road ahead and the strange sense of liberation flowing through me. For 32 years, I'd been trying to earn their approval, to prove I was worthy of their love and respect. Tonight, I'd finally realised that some people's approval isn't worth having. My Victorian house came into view, its wraparound porch and bay windows illuminated by the vintage street lamps I'd had installed last month. I'd bought the house 60 months ago, a foreclosure that had been sitting empty for 2 years, neglected and forgotten. Most people had seen it as a money pit, but I'd seen potential, just like I'd learned to see potential in struggling businesses. I'd seen what this house could become with the right investment of time, money, and care. I pulled into the driveway and sat in my car for a moment, looking at the house that represented everything I'd accomplished on my own. The down payment had come from my business profits. The renovation budget came from contracts I'd secured through my own hard work and expertise. Every decision, every improvement, every detail had been mine to make without having to consider anyone else's opinions or expectations. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Jennifer. Sarah, that was completely unnecessary. Marcus was just upset about work stress. You didn't have to make such a scene. I stared at the message, amazed by her ability to minimise what had happened. Marcus hadn't been upset about work stress. He'd been deliberately cruel, attacking my character in front of the entire family. But Jennifer's response was typical of how my family handled conflict, by pretending it wasn't as bad as it seemed, and expecting the victim to be the bigger person. More messages followed. Aunt Helen, sweetheart, please call me. We need to talk about tonight. Uncle Frank. That was a generous gesture, but you didn't need to pay for everyone. Even my cousin David, who hadn't spoken to me in 3 years, heard about dinner. That was pretty dramatic, even for you. The last message stung because it revealed how they saw me, as someone prone to drama, someone who overreacted to minor slights. They couldn't conceive that their behaviour might have been genuinely hurtful, that their years of dismissing my achievements and questioning my worth might have finally pushed me to my breaking point. I turned off my phone and went inside, pouring myself a glass of wine and settling into the window seat in my living room. The house was quiet, except for the gentle ticking of the antique clock I'd found at an estate sale. I spent countless evenings in this spot, reading business journals and planning strategies for my clients. But tonight, I just sat and thought about the family I'd left behind at Romano's. The next morning brought a new wave of messages, but also something unexpected. A call from my business partner, Rachel, who had become one of my closest friends over the past 3 years. I heard about last night, she said without preamble. Jennifer posted something on Facebook about a family drama at dinner. Are you okay? I found myself laughing, though there wasn't much humour in it. Jennifer posted about it on social media. A very vague post about how some people can't handle honest family discussions and resort to grand gestures instead of mature conversation, Rachel said. I'm reading between the lines here, but it sounds like you finally told them what you think of their treatment of you. Something like that, I said, and found myself telling Rachel the whole story. She listened without interrupting, occasionally making sounds of disgust at my family's behaviour. Good for you, she said when I finished. I've been watching them treat you like garbage for years. It's about time you stood up for yourself. You've been watching them? I asked, surprised. Sarah, you talk about your family constantly, Rachel said gently. Every holiday, every family gathering, you come back upset and frustrated because they've made you feel small again. I've been waiting for you to realise that their opinion of you says more about them than it does about you. It was a sobering realisation that my closest friend had been watching me torture myself, trying to win approval from people who would never give it. I'd been so focused on proving my worth to my family that I'd failed to see how obvious their toxicity was to outside observers. The thing is, Rachel continued, they have no idea how successful you really are, do they? I hope that's enough contribution for you, cousin, I said, my voice steady and cold, because it's the last contribution you'll ever get from me. I picked up my purse and coat, ignoring the shocked faces and stammering voices around the table. Sarah, wait, Aunt Helen called out, but I didn't turn around. I walked out of Romano's with my head held high, leaving behind not just a dinner bill, but an entire family that had never deserved my loyalty in the first place. What happens next? How does Sarah's family react to her dramatic exit? And what shocking truth about her success will they discover? Chapter 2 reveals the devastating aftermath of underestimating the selfish family member. Remember when we were kids? Marcus said, his voice growing louder as the wine took effect. And Sarah used to follow us around everywhere. She was always trying so hard to keep up, to be part of what those days, being the youngest cousin, desperately wanting to be included in the games and adventures of the older kids, always feeling like I was on the outside looking in. She was so determined, Aunt Helen added with false fondness, always working twice as hard as everyone else just to prove she belonged. The past tense wasn't lost on me. In their minds, I was still that little girl trying to prove herself, still desperate for their acceptance and approval. They couldn't see that I'd grown up, that I'd built a life I was proud of, that I no longer needed their validation. Some things never change, Jennifer said with a laugh that felt like a slap. Sarah's still working twice as hard as everyone else, just in a different way. At least she's working, Uncle Frank said, raising his glass again. Though I do worry about all that stress. It's not healthy for a woman to be so driven. You'll burn yourself out, sweetheart. The condescension was breathtaking. Here was a man who'd inherited his father's business and coasted on family connections his entire life, lecturing me about the dangers of ambition. I bit my tongue and smiled politely, but inside I was seething. The waiter appeared to clear our plates and take dessert orders. As he worked his way around the table, I found myself calculating the cost of the meal. 18 people, multiple courses, several bottles of expensive wine. The bill was going to be substantial. I wondered who was planning to pay for it, since no one had mentioned splitting the cheque or taking turns covering the cost. I think we should do a toast, Marcus announced, standing up with his wine glass in hand. To family, to the bonds that tie us together, to the support we give each other, to the success we've all achieved through hard work and dedication. Everyone raised their glasses, and I found myself going through the motions despite the bitter irony of the toast. What support had they given me? When had they celebrated my achievements or offered encouragement during difficult times? The bonds Marcus spoke of seemed to flow in only one direction, toward the family members who fit their narrow definition of success. And, Marcus continued, his voice growing more emotional, to the family members who've always been there for us, who've contributed to our success, who've made sacrifices for the good of the family. His eyes swept around the table, making contact with various relatives as he spoke. When his gaze reached me, it moved on quickly, as if I were invisible. The message was clear. I wasn't included in his definition of family members who had contributed or made sacrifices. The slight was so obvious that several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jennifer looked down at her dessert, and even Aunt Helen seemed embarrassed by her son's exclusion of me from his toast. But Marcus wasn't finished. As we all sat back down and began eating our desserts, he launched into a story about how the Pearl family had rallied around Uncle Frank when his business was struggling 5 years ago. We all pitched in, he said, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority. Everyone contributed what they could. Money, connections, advice, support. That's what family does. We take care of each other. I remembered that situation differently. Uncle Frank's restaurant had been failing because of his poor management and refusal to adapt to changing customer preferences. The family had indeed rallied around him, but their help had enabled his bad decisions rather than forcing him to confront his mistakes. The restaurant had eventually failed anyway, and Uncle Frank had blamed everyone but himself. Of course, not everyone was in a position to help, Marcus continued, and this time his eyes found mine and stayed there. Some people were too busy with their own little projects to contribute to the family effort. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. I felt Frank's doomed restaurant. The truth was, I had offered to help, not with money, but with my expertise in business operations. I'd spent hours analysing Uncle Frank's financials and developing a comprehensive plan to turn the restaurant around. But my suggestions had been dismissed because they would have required Uncle Frank to acknowledge his mistakes and make difficult changes. It had been easier for the family to throw money at the problem and hope it would go away. I remember offering to help with a business plan, I said quietly, my voice steady, despite the anger building inside me. But Uncle Frank wasn't interested in operational changes. Oh yes, Marcus said with a dismissive wave of his hand. You offered some advice, but when it came time for real support, for actual sacrifice, you were nowhere to be found. The unfairness of the accusation took my breath away. I'd been building my business from scratch at the time, working 100-hour weeks and living on ramen noodles to make ends meet. I hadn't had thousands of dollars to throw at a failing restaurant, but I offered what I could. My time, my expertise, my genuine desire to help. I was starting my own business, I said, my voice growing stronger. I didn't have the financial resources that some family members had, but I offered what I could. Excuses, Marcus said, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. There are always excuses when it comes to real commitment, real sacrifice for the family. I looked around the table, hoping to see some support, some recognition that Marcus was being unfair. But most of my relatives were staring at their dessert plates, unwilling to get involved in the confrontation. A few nodded along with Marcus's words, apparently agreeing with his assessment of my character. The truth is, Marcus continued, emboldened by the family's silence, some people take from the family without ever giving back. They show up to dinners and celebrations. They enjoy the benefits of being part of this family. But when it comes time to contribute, to make sacrifices, to put the family first, they're nowhere to be found. The attack was so personal, so vicious, that I felt like I'd been physically assaulted. This was my family, people who were supposed to love and support me, and they were sitting silently while Marcus destroyed my character and questioned my loyalty. That's not fair, I said, my voice shaking with emotion. I've always been there for this family, maybe not with money, but with time, with support, with genuine care. Really? Marcus's voice dripped with sarcasm. When have you ever put this family first? When have you ever made a real sacrifice for any of us? The questions hit like hammer blows because I couldn't answer them in a way that would satisfy him. How could I explain the emotional support I'd given to various family members over the years? How could I quantify the time I'd spent listening to their problems, offering advice, celebrating their successes, even when they never reciprocated? You've never contributed to this family, Marcus shouted, his voice echoing off the walls of the private dining room. You take and take and take, but you never give anything back. You're selfish, Sarah. You've always been selfish, and you always will. The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I looked around the table at the faces of my family members, some embarrassed, some uncomfortable, but none willing to defend me against Marcus's brutal attack. In that moment, something inside me snapped, not into anger, but into clarity. I saw these people for who they really were, not the loving family I'd been desperately trying to belong to, but a group of people who measured worth by bank accounts and social status, who confused financials, contribution with emotional support, purse and pulled out my phone, opening my banking app with fingers that were remarkably steady despite the storm raging inside me. The dinner bill would be expensive, probably close to $2,000 for 18 people at a restaurant this upscale. But I had the money. My little startup had been more successful than any of them knew. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet room. Every eye was on me as I walked to the front of the dining room, where our waiter was preparing to bring the check. "Excuse me," I said to the waiter, my voice calm and professional. "I'd like to pay the bill for the entire table." The waiter looked confused, glancing back at the table full of people who were now staring at us with expressions ranging from shock to curiosity. "The entire table, miss?" he asked. "Yes," I said, pulling out my credit card. "Everything, food, drinks, tax, and please add a 25% tip." As the waiter processed my payment, I could hear the murmur of confused voices from the table behind me. I signed the receipt, thanked the waiter, and walked back to the table where my family sat in stunned silence. "There," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the quiet room. "I've contributed to the family, $2,347 to be exact." I looked directly at Marcus, whose face had gone pale as he realised what I'd done. The sound of 18 voices talking over each other filled the private dining room at Romano's, the upscale Italian restaurant my family had chosen for our annual reunion dinner. I sat at the far end of the long table, nursing my second glass of wine and watching my relatives perform their usual social theatre. The same dynamics that had played out for the past 15 years, ever since I'd graduated college and started building my own life, away from their suffocating expectations. My cousin Marcus held court at the head of the table, regaling everyone with stories about his latest real estate deals and his son's acceptance to Princeton. Aunt Helen nodded approvingly, while Uncle Frank raised his glass in yet another toast to family success. The conversation flowed around topics I'd grown tired of hearing. Who was making the most money? Whose children were attending the most prestigious schools? Which family members had bought the biggest houses or taken the most exotic vacations? I checked my phone discreetly, noting that it was already 8:30. The dinner had started at 6, and we were still only halfway through the main course. At this rate, we'd be here until midnight, and I had an early morning meeting with a potential client who could change the trajectory of my consulting business forever. "Sarah, you're awfully quiet tonight," my cousin Jennifer said from across the table, her voice carrying that particular tone that meant she was about to say something designed to put me in my place. "Still working at that little startup of yours?" The way she said "little startup" made it sound like I was running a lemonade stand rather than a successful consulting firm that specialised in helping small businesses optimise their operations. I'd built the company from nothing over the past 5 years, working 18-hour days and sacrificing every weekend to establish myself in a competitive market. But to my family, if it wasn't a Fortune 500 company or a prestigious law firm, it didn't count as real success. "Actually, we just signed our biggest client yet," I replied, keeping my voice pleasant, despite the familiar irritation rising in my chest. "A tech company that's expanding into 3 new markets. It's exciting work." "That's nice, dear, Auntie," Helen said, with the kind of patronising smile she'd perfected over 60 years of being the family matriarch. "Though I do worry about you working so hard without a husband to support you. At your age, about settling down. I was 32 years old, financially independent, and happier than I'd ever been in my life. But to my family, my success meant nothing if I didn't have a man to validate it and children to prove my worth as a woman. I'm perfectly happy with my life as it is, I said, taking another sip of wine to keep myself from saying what I really thought about their outdated attitudes. Of course you are, Marcus interjected, his voice carrying the condescending tone he'd used with me since we were children. Though it must be nice not having any real responsibilities. No mortgage, no kids to put through college, no one depending on you. Must be quite the carefree lifestyle. The comment stung, because it was so fundamentally wrong. I had plenty of responsibilities, to my employees, to my clients, to the charities I supported quietly without fanfare. But more than that, it revealed how little my family actually knew about my life, how little they'd bothered to learn about what I'd accomplished or what mattered to me. Actually, I just bought a house, I said, deciding to share some good news despite knowing they'd find a way to diminish it. A beautiful Victorian in the historic district. I'm really excited about the renovation project. How lovely, Jennifer said, though her expression suggested she found it anything but. Though, I can't imagine why you'd want such an old house. All that maintenance and upkeep. Wouldn't a nice condo be more practical for someone in your situation? My situation, apparently, was being a successful single woman who didn't need anyone's approval to make major life decisions. But Jennifer's comment revealed the underlying assumption that had always governed my family's attitude toward me, that my choices were somehow temporary, that I was just marking time until I found a man to take care of me and make my real life begin. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I found myself increasingly disconnected from the discussion. These people shared my DNA, but they felt like strangers. They talked about family loyalty and staying connected, but they'd never shown any genuine interest in my life or my achievements. I was included in these gatherings out of obligation, not affection.